All right, learners, today we're going to talk about two important reform movements of the Gilded Age. First, populism, and that's going to be the bulk of what we discuss, and then the civil service reform. Both of these play a pretty important role in politics during this time. And as we gain some momentum as we head towards Friday, which is when the test is going to be, these are also two things that could possibly show up on there as well. So we'll talk first about populism, then we'll discuss civil service reform, and we'll move on from there. I want to start with a political cartoon first today. So take a look at that political cartoon on the right and use some of the tools that you know. Look at the images, the symbols, look at what the writing is. I'm going to ask you a couple questions about it. You don't really know much about the subject or the topic that the cartoon is on yet, but that's okay. You won't necessarily need them to be able to answer the questions. So go ahead and examine that, and then I'm going to ask you a couple questions about that. All right. The first question asks, what is this balloon? What are some of the People's Party balloon? What is some of the subdivisions or patches that it's made up of? You might have seen things on there like the Farmers Alliance or the Free Silver Party. I believe they've got Socialist, Communist, Old Granger Party, Knights Labor Party, Old Greenback Party. So there are lots of different groups that sort of make up this People's Party. The second question asked, what the cartoonist might be implying by saying that this balloon, it's a hot air balloon, so it's full of hot air. You've heard that phrase before, you know, that when somebody's full of hot air or something, or just kind of blowing smoke is another term that we use, another phrase that we use. It just means that what they're saying is not really based in fact, that they're just kind of talking for the sake of talking, and they don't really have any substance to what they're arguing. So you can probably surmise from this that the cartoonist is not in favor of the People's Party, the populist movement. And then finally, the third one says the people in the balloon seem to be looking in all different directions. What do you think that means? Well, if they're looking in different directions, perhaps maybe the party's a little bit divided and headed in different directions, or has different goals. So hopefully you got that from the political cartoon here. We're going to talk a little bit about the Populist Party, the People's Party, and what they're into. So there are several problems that farmers are facing at the end of the 1800s, and to be honest, it's really not a great time to be a farmer for a couple of reasons. Number one, rapid deflation that's happening after the Civil War. You guys know what inflation is. You might never really thought about the opposite of deflation, which means prices are going down. This is a huge problem for farmers who have a ton of debt. Think of it this way. Let's say you go out and buy a car for $20,000 tomorrow. Okay, so now you've got your car and you're making your car payments, and you've got this car loan that you're paying on. You've got your job that you use to be able to make your monthly payments and everything else like that. Now let's say that 2 years from now the economy plummets and minimum wage gets cut in half. Okay, and then now you're still trying to make payments on your car, but guess what? Your wages, your job, your pay has been cut in half, but that $20,000 debt that you owe for your car stays the same. So when deflation happens, you're making less money to pay off debts that are essentially the same as they've always been. So it's twice as burdensome to try to pay off those debts. Farmers are in the same position. They either had to borrow money to buy their farms or their farming equipment or anything else like that, but they owe lots of money. And all those loans are difficult to pay off now that deflation has occurred, and they're not making nearly as much money for their crops. What only adds to that problem is the mass overproduction of crops. Not only did you have tons and tons of farmers that had gone west hoping that they were going to get rich and live this American dream by farming, but now, not only that, but when they weren't making enough money doing so, they thought, well, okay, well, I'm not making enough money. That means I just need to farm more. And so they produce more crops. And as you guys know, the more you produce, the greater the supply, the lower the price will go. The more supply that is out there, the more prices will fall. And so they continue to overproduce and produce and produce and produce, and that does nothing but bring prices down even further for crops and make it very, very difficult to make any money selling them. What makes matters even worse are the railroads, who realize that they pretty much have a monopoly in the West. If you're out there farming, there's probably only one or maybe two railroad spurs that come anywhere near your farm. And so the only option that you have to be able to get your crops back to the east or back to a market to sell them is to use those railroads. And once the railroads understand that they have that advantage over you, then they can charge whatever they want and kind of gouge the farmers with these outrageous prices because they know that the farmers need to use them. So these three problems, if you kind of combine them, make it very, very difficult to be a farmer and really hard to make any kind of money. So farmers decide they're going to do something about it. They get together. They kind of use the pattern that they saw some of the people in the city doing when they formed unions, and they decide to come together. The very first organization is called the Grange, and the Grange was formed by Oliver Hudson Kelley. And the idea behind the Grange was they were going to petition and talk to their local politicians and ask for them to fight against the railroads and to kind of regulate the railroads to keep them from taking advantage of them. The Grange also tried to pressure railroad companies themselves and protest. And because a result of their protest, they were able to form local Granger laws. It kind of worked in a way where some of the states passed laws that regulated interstate commerce and regulated what the railroads could charge or would charge to some degree. But they have bigger visions and they wanted more. It was going to take more than just this to do this. The Grange, by the way, also recognized one of the eternal problems of farmers in that they were isolated from lots of people. And so the Grange tried to organize like dances and I don't know, square dances or barn, I don't know how it goes, but they try to organize social events for farmers so they wouldn't have to be so lonely. Hence the graphic on the left side there. You don't have to be lonely if you're a member of the Grange. After that, to try to build off that and get a little bit farther, members of the Grange kind of break off and they start forming this larger group called the Farmers Alliance. And now there were Farmers Alliances all over the country, at different parts, like the North and the South, Southeast, and different places. But the Farmers Alliances formed what they called co-op stores. In other words, they would buy all of their supplies and goods from wholesalers to try to save money, and then they would run these little wholesaler stores to try to cut back. You guys know it's the same kind of idea why you go to Sam's or you go to Costco or anything else like that. You buy in bulk, you save. So they joined together, bought stuff in bulk, and then saved the money that way. So they kind of created these little co-op stores. They also bought community mills, like mills that all of the farmers could use, so they didn't have to pay other companies to use their mills. Instead, they had these kind of co-op mills. So they start to work together in this way. But a lot of people start to break off from the Farmers Alliances and the Grange because they think there needs to be more political change. They need more representation in government to help kind of fight for farmers' rights. And so because neither the Grange or the Farmers Alliance is very successful in doing this, you see the emergence of something called the Populist Party. And sometimes we also hear this referred to as the People's Party. And the Populist Party was formed on many of these farmers and their ideas that they were going to fight for their rights so they could economically compete in America. So what was the Populist Party all about? A couple of things. They knew as farmers that they weren't going to be able to carry enough votes because there are only so many farmers. So they also tried to appeal to a number of poor workers in the city, some of your common laborers. And they figured if they could get some of those people involved in the People's Party, the Populist Party, then they would have more political power because there'd be more people voting. So number one, they wanted to try to increase the money supply. They were trying to fight against deflation. If prices are going down and the value of money is going down, what the best possible thing you can do is to increase the money that's in circulation. We talk about this all the time when people are like, hey, we're in debt. Why don't we just print lots of more money, right? Okay, that's kind of what they're trying to do here, is because if there's more cash in circulation, that will actually cause inflation rather than deflation. But the problem was at the time is that the United States believed in something called the gold standard. That meant they only printed money for which they had gold to back it up. In other words, every dollar, every paper dollar printed was backed up by its worth in gold somewhere, okay? So in order to increase the money supply, they said, well, we only have so much gold. What if we also backed our paper money with silver? And so they suggested also adding silver as coinage to increase the money supply, then cause inflation and hopefully improve farmers' debts in that way. Another thing that they wanted was a graduated income tax. And what they mean by graduated income tax is that if you make a lot less, you pay a smaller percentage of your income than those people that make a lot more. And they felt like this would be a fair way to tax the people, but also provide an income tax, create tax revenue that would be generated mostly from more wealthy individuals, which, by the way, is not normally farmers. Another thing that they wanted was government ownership of the railroad, not just regulation. They wanted the government to control the railroad so that they would be fair and they would be treated fairly. They also believed that the government should control utilities like telegraph lines and things like that. They also wanted to appeal to some of the people in the city. They added a couple other things as well. They wanted the direct election of senators. Right at the time, the senators of each state were elected by the state legislatures, and they said no, the people need to have more of a voice in what's going on in the Senate, and so the people wanted to be able to vote for them, and so that's one thing that the populists called for. And they also called for the limited 8-hour workday. Again, this is totally in there to try to appeal to people in the city who wouldn't normally join a farmers party, but might join a party that supports things like this. And so many city workers, immigrants, and poor laborers that, well, okay, 8-hour workday, that's something that I want. So that would appeal to them as well. Finally, they fought for something called the secret ballot. This is where, I mean, it's exactly what it sounds like when you go to vote, that your voting choices would be, and the secrecy of it would be maintained. This would keep wealthy and powerful business people from hopefully, from influencing people to vote a certain way. Because if your vote is completely and entirely a secret, and they never know which way you vote, then you can be free to vote your conscience and not be manipulated by businessmen or whoever, political machines, those kinds of things. Okay, so let's go back for a second to this increasing the money supply, because this is a huge deal for the populists. This idea of backing American money on gold or silver. And throughout the populist party's rise, you're going to have two types of people. You have what you call the real conservative gold bugs, who are people that believe that the money should only be backed by gold. And then you've got the silverites, people who believe that you should also back money with silver. If you were a silverite and you believed in backing it with both gold and silver, they call this bimetallism. Okay, so the difference is who these people are. Our gold bugs are more wealthy bankers and businessmen, whereas silverites are farmers and laborers. And the gold standard would obviously put less money into circulation, while silver would put more money into circulation. Now, here's the thing: our gold bugs wanted less money because that meant that the loans that were going to be repaid would be in stable money. And basically what that means is that they could guarantee that the value of those loans would be what they would expect. Okay, when you pay back those loans, it's going to be with money that that the creditors know will actually be good and be worth the value that it is. Silverites wanted things sold at higher prices because that meant they could pay back their debts and make more money for growing crops, things like that. So the effects of either would be, if you're going to have gold, only the gold standard, it's going to be deflation. We talked about what that means. Prices fall, the value of money increases, you can buy more with a dollar, but fewer people have money. Inflation means prices rise. Your dollar doesn't buy you as much, but more people have money and it's more common. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. Our more conservative gold bugs, not populists, want to be backed by the gold standard. Our populists want both metals so they can increase that money supply. It becomes easier a little bit to pay off debts, and they can kind of sell their crops for more money. So the populists go through this, and they try to gain political advantage by electing a president. Their candidate in 1892 is a man by the name of James B. Weaver, not pictured. Okay, James B. Weaver he runs in 1892. The party is somewhat divided. Not all the Farmers Alliance people are on board yet. There's some questions among those members of the Populist Party, is kind of like that balloon cartoon we looked at. Some people are looking different directions, and so as a whole, they were just way too divided. But it does get the attention of the American public, and the Populist Party is kind of on the scene now, and people recognize them. So by the time we get to the next election cycle in 1896 is the true rise of the populists, and they are ready to make their stance in politics. And they put their support in actually not a populist candidate, but a Democratic candidate named William Jennings Bryan. He was the Democratic candidate, so they felt like just being part of one of the major parties, he had a little bit of an advantage, and he was more likely to be elected. But he was very sympathetic to the farmers and to what they wanted. And so they throw all of their votes in his vote, hoping that he's going to deliver them. And he becomes a very impassioned speaker and delivers what they call the cross of gold speech, where he likens the country being put on the gold standard to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, and this whole religious imagery that he thought would really appeal to a lot of American people. And so maybe a little bit over dramatic, but nevertheless very impassioned and won over a lot of people in that way. So the populists put all their faith in him, and he looks like a very viable candidate. But when it comes down to it in the election, a more conservative, more moderate William McKinley, who is the Republican, wins the election, barely wins the popular vote, does a little bit better in the electoral vote. But when he wins, it kind of kills populism. The dream was all invested in this William Jennings Bryan in this 1896 election. And when it fails, the Populist Party pretty much divides and falls apart. But the ideas of reform and the ideas of helping the common people and the common worker are going to persist and reverberate throughout the Gilded Age, and eventually are going to lead to reform later in the Progressive era. So populism, the rise and the fall of the farmer here is very quick. There's a lot of excitement around the opportunity to maybe fight for their rights. They kind of inch forward in some ways, but when populism fails in the election of 1896, our farmers kind of end up right where they started, and so they don't really get the gains that they had originally hoped for. Okay, so the other reform issue that we need to talk about during the Gilded Age is something called civil service reform, and it's all about who gets government jobs. So back several years previous to this, there was a president called Andrew Jackson who believed in something called the spoils system. And basically what that meant is that when you were elected, you ended up giving government jobs to the people who helped you get elected. Now, that might seem or sound fair to you, except for the problem is that a lot of your friends, a lot of the people that help get you elected aren't always really super qualified to do the job. So while it was a good system for the presidents to reward the people that got them there and got them into that position, it wasn't necessarily always the best thing for the American people. Well, that lasted for a long time until along comes President Rutherford B. Hayes, who was very much a reformer and wanted to change the civil service system and give jobs to people that actually deserved it rather than the spoils system. A lot of people in the Republican Party, his party, didn't like that. They became known as stalwarts, and his group of Republicans became known as reformers. There were even people in the middle who were kind of reform and kind of stalwart, and so they called them half-breeds. So the Republican Party was all split up. The next election, they are kind of divided. The Republicans don't know how they want to do because they're all kind of split up on this issue. So they decide they're going to try to elect a president who is technically what they call a half-breed. He's in between reform and stalwart, with a stalwart vice president by the name of Chester A. Arthur. So Garfield becomes president, and it looks very seriously like he's going to follow in the footsteps of Rutherford B. Hayes and change the spoils system and actually give people jobs that deserve it. Well, the stalwart Republicans do not like that, especially the crazy ones. Enter assassin Charles Guiteau, who is very big. He called himself the stalwart of all stalwarts, but he was also just kind of like really actually crazy. And so he shoots James Garfield in the subway and kills him. Garfield actually hangs on for quite some time, and given modern medicine or anything more modern than the late 1800s, he probably would have lived, but it was like the late 1800s, so he didn't. And he dies, and Charles Guiteau's like, yeah, ha, I got him. Guiteau also obviously goes to prison, like, he's crazy, so there's that too. But he's like, okay, I killed him, and the vice president that we put with him is a stalwart, so now spoils system will live forever. So here comes Chester A. Arthur, the vice president. And you're like, yeah, he's a stalwart. Mission accomplished, and so the stalwart Republicans are going to be forever in charge, and there will always be a spoils system. Until there isn't. And Chester A. Arthur's like, yeah, I'm a stalwart, but I really kind of feel like it's my job to honor James Garfield and what he was going to do. So instead, I'm going to kind of be sort of a reformer right now, and we're going to overthrow the spoils system. A lot of drama. It's kind of like the like Real Housewives of the White House here. But what you end up with is a dead president, just pretty much because of the fact that he was going to give people jobs in government that they deserved rather than just give it out to his friends. In the end, that's kind of the way that it ends up. So, in conclusion, what you end up with is the patronage system or the spoils system, where you gave jobs just to anybody. That is done, and it is replaced or overthrown by something called the Pendleton Civil Service Act. The Pendleton Civil Service Act did a couple things, but primarily it made what they call the civil service exam, and that people who were applying for government jobs actually had to take the exam to prove that they had some kind of somewhat competence to be able to do that job, which should result in more qualified candidates. By the way, the civil service exam still exists and is used in many things. For example, if you want to be a police officer in, say, I don't know, Sherman, Texas, you need to take and pass a civil service exam to prove you kind of know what you're talking about. So civil service reform does happen, and as a result, the spoils system is gone, and people in government are given jobs, hopefully based on their qualifications and not so much on whether they are the friend of the president. Although some people would debate that that actually is still true anyway. Nevertheless, reform has taken place. So we have both populism, which is a reform movement to help the farmers, and civil service reform, which is a reform movement to hopefully make government employees more qualified to do their jobs and serve the people. And while populism is not successful, civil service reform is successful and does result in some change with the Pendleton Service Act. Two reform movements, one lesson, lots of economics and kind of boring politics in there, but you know, it could be on the test, so that's why we do it. Our closing activity for you today is you're going to find the populism worksheet, Google Form worksheet. It's pretty simple. You do the reading there, and after you do the reading, you kind of apply what we've talked about here and what you know, and you type those answers and answer those questions and then submit the form. Should be relatively simple. Keep in mind, test is coming up Friday. You will get the review sheet next on Wednesday, so that gives you 2 or 3 days to get yourself ready to take that test. So please make sure that you're looking for that. That's all for today. Have a good one. We'll talk to you later.